"It seems to me an awfully silly thing that you are going to do," said Catherine. "I'll think you realize that yourself." Ruth Kettering buried her face in her hands. "I don't know. Ever since I left Victoria I have had a horrible feeling of something that is coming to me very soon, that I can't escape." She clutched convulsively at Catherine's hand. "You must think I am mad talking to you like this. No, something horrible is going to happen, but I tell you I don't think it," said Catherine. "Try to pull yourself together. You could send your father a wire from Paris, if you like, and he would come to you at once." The other brightened. "Yes, I could do that. Dear old Dad. It is queer, but I never knew until today how terribly fond of him I am." She sat up and dried her eyes with a handkerchief. "I have been very foolish. Thank you so much for letting me talk to you. I don't know why I got into such a queer, hysterical state." She got up. "I am quite all right now. I suppose, really, I just needed someone to talk to. I can't think now why I have been making such an absolute fool of myself." Catherine got up too. "I am so glad you feel better," she said, trying to make her voice sound as conventional as possible. She was only too well aware that the aftermath of confidences is embarrassment. She added tactfully, "I must be going back to my own compartment." She emerged into the corridor at the same time as the maid was also coming out from the next door. The latter looked towards Catherine, over her shoulder, and an expression of intense surprise showed itself on her face. Catherine turned also, but by that time whoever it was who had aroused the maid's interest had retreated into his or her compartment, and the corridor was empty. Catherine walked down it to regain her own place, which was in the next coach. As she passed the end compartment the door opened and a woman's face looked out for a moment and then pulled the door to sharply. It was a face not easily forgotten, as Catherine was to know when she saw it again. A beautiful face, oval and dark, very heavily made up in a bizarre fashion. Catherine had a feeling that she had seen it before somewhere. She regained her own compartment without other adventure and sat for some time thinking of the confidence which had just been made to her. She wondered idly who the woman in the mink coat might be, wondered also how the end of her story would turn out. "If I have stopped anyone from making an idiot of themselves, suppose I have done good work," she thought to herself. But who knows? That is the kind of woman who is hard-headed and egotistical all her life, and it might be good for her to do the other sort of thing for a change. "Oh, well, I don't suppose I shall ever see her again. She certainly won't want to see me again. That is the worst of letting people tell you things. They never do." She hoped that she would not be given the same table at dinner. She reflected, not without humor, that it might be awkward for both of them. Leaning back with her head against a cushion she felt tired and vaguely depressed. They had reached Paris, and the slow journey round the Cincha, with its interminable stops and waits, was very wearisome. When they arrived at the Gare de Lyon she was glad to get out and walk up and down the platform. The keen cold air was refreshing after the steam-heated train. She observed with a smile that her friend of the mink coat was solving the possible awkwardness of the dinner problem in her own way. A dinner basket was being handed up and received through the window by the maid. When the train started once more, and dinner was announced by a violent ringing of bells, Catherine went along to it much relieved in mind. Her vis-a-vis tonight was of an entirely different kind, a small man, distinctly foreign in appearance, mustache, and an egg-shaped head which one side. Catherine had taken in a book to with a rigidly waxed he carried rather on dinner with her. She found the little man's eyes fixed on it with a kind of twinkling amusement. "I see, madam, that you have a Roman policy. You are fond of such things." "They amuse me," Catherine admitted. The little man nodded with the air of complete understanding. "They have a good sale always, so I am told." "Now why is that, mademoiselle? I ask it of you as a student of human nature, why should that be?" Catherine felt more and more amused. "Perhaps they give one the illusion of living an exciting life," she suggested. He nodded gravely. "Yes, there is something in that. Of course, one knows that such things don't really happen," Catherine was continuing, but he interrupted her sharply. Sometimes, mademoiselle. Sometimes. I who speak to you, they have happened to me. She threw him a quick, interested glance. Some day, who knows, you might be in the thick of things, he went on. It is all chance. Don't think it is likely, said Catherine, nothing of that kind ever happens to me. He leaned forward. Would you like it to? The question startled her, and she drew in her breath sharply. It is my fancy, perhaps, said the little man, as he dexterously polished one of the forks, but I think that you have a yearning in you for interesting happenings. Eh bien, mademoiselle, all through my life I have observed one thing, all one wants one gets. Who knows? His face screwed itself up comically. You may get more than you bargain for. Is that a prophecy, the table? Asked Catherine, smiling as she rose from the little man shook his head. I'll never prophesy, he declared pompously. It is true that I have the habit of being always right, but I do not boast of it. Good night, mademoiselle, and may you sleep well. Catherine went back along the train amused and entertained by her little neighbor. She passed the open door of her friend's compartment and saw the conductor making up the bed. The lady in the mink coat was standing looking out of the window. The second compartment, as Catherine saw through the communicating door, was empty, with rugs and bags heaped up on the mat. The maid was not there. Catherine found her own bed prepared, and since she was tired, she went to bed and switched off her light about 9:30. She woke with a sudden start. How much time had passed she did not know. Glancing at her watch, she found that it had stopped. A feeling of intense uneasiness pervaded her and grew stronger moment by moment. At last she got up, threw her dressing gown round her shoulders, and stepped out into the corridor. The whole train seemed wrapped in slumber. Catherine let down the window and sat by it for some minutes, drinking in the cool night air and trying vainly to calm her uneasy fears. She presently decided that she would go along to the end and ask the conductor for the right time so that she could set her watch. She found, however, that his little chair was vacant. She hesitated for a moment and then walked through into the next coach. She looked down the long, dim line of the corridor and saw, to her surprise, that a man was standing with his hand on the door of the compartment occupied by the lady in the mink coat. That is to say, she thought it was the compartment. Probably, however, she was mistaken. He stood there for a moment or two with his back to her, seeming uncertain and hesitating in his attitude. Then he slowly turned, and with an odd feeling of fatality, Catherine recognized him as the same man whom she had noticed twice before, once in the corridor of the Savoy Hotel and once in Cook's offices. Then he opened the door of the compartment and passed in, drawing it to behind him. An idea flashed across Catherine's mind. Could this be the man of whom the other woman had, the man she was journeying to meet? Then Catherine told herself that she was romancing. Probability she had mistaken the compartment. In all she went back to her own carriage. 5 minutes later the train slackened speed. There was the long plaintive hiss of the Westinghouse brake, and a few minutes later the train came to a stop at Lyons. Chapter 11 Murder. Catherine wakened the next morning to brilliant sunshine. She went along to breakfast early, but met none of her acquaintances of the day before. When she returned to her compartment it had just been restored to its daytime appearance by the conductor, a dark man with a mustache and melancholy face. "Madam is fortunate," he said, "the sun shines." It is always a great disappointment to passengers when they arrive on a grey morning. Elle should have been disappointed, certainly, said Catherine. The man prepared to depart. "We are rather late, madam," he said. "Before we get to Nice. Elle will let you know." Just Catherine nodded. She sat by the window, entranced by the sunlit panorama. The pallid trees, the deep blue of the sea, the bright yellow mimosa came with all the charm of novelty to the woman who for 14 years had known only the drab winters of England. When they arrived at Caen, Catherine got out and walked up and down the platform. She was curious about the lady in the mink coat, and looked up at the windows of her compartment. The blinds were still drawn down, the only ones to be so on the whole train. Catherine wondered a little, and when she re-entered the train she passed along the corridor and noticed that these two compartments were still shuttered and closed. The lady of the mink coat was clearly no early riser. Presently the conductor came to her and told her that in a few minutes the train would arrive at Nice. Catherine handed him a tip. The man thanked her, but still lingered. There was something odd about him. Catherine, who had at first wondered whether the tip had not been big enough, was now convinced that something far more serious was amiss. His face was of a sickly pallor, he was shaking all over, and looked as if he had been frightened out of his life. He was eyeing her in a curious manner. Presently he said abruptly, "Madam will excuse me, but is she expecting friends to meet her at Nice?" "Probably," said Catherine. "Why?" But the man merely shook his head and murmured something that Catherine could not catch and moved away, not reappearing until the train came to rest at the station, when he started handing her belongings down from the window. Catherine stood for a moment or two on the platform rather at a loss, but a fair young man with an ingenuous face came up to her and said rather hesitatingly, "Miss Grey, is it not?" Catherine said that it was, and the young man beamed upon her seraphically and murmured, "I am Chubby, you know, Lady Tamplin's husband. I expect she mentioned me, but perhaps she forgot. Have you got your billet de bagages? I lost mine when I came out this year, and you would not believe the fuss they made about it. Regular French red tape." Catherine produced it, and was just about to move off beside him when a very gentle and insidious voice murmured in her ear, "A little moment, madam, if you please." Catherine turned to behold an individual who made up for insignificance of stature by a large quantity of gold lace and uniform. The individual explained. There were certain formalities. Madam would perhaps be so kind as to accompany him. The regulations of the police. He threw up his arms. Absurd, doubtless, but there it was. Mr. Chubby Evans listened with a very imperfect comprehension, his French being of a limited order. "So like the French," murmured Mr. Evans. He was one of those staunch patriotic Britons who, having made a portion of a foreign country their own, strongly resent the original inhabitants of it. Always up to some silly dodge or other. They've never tackled people on the station before, though. This is something quite new. I suppose you'll have to go." Catherine departed with her guide. Somewhat to her surprise, he led her towards a siding where a coach of the departed train had been shunted. He invited her to mount into this, and, preceding her down the compartments corridor, held aside the door of one of the in it was a pompous-looking official personage, and with him a nondescript being who appeared to be a clerk. The pompous-looking personage rose politely, bowed to Catherine, and said, "You will excuse me, madam, but there are certain formalities to be complied with." "Madam speaks French, I trust." "Sufficiently, I think, monsieur," replied Language. "That is good. Pray be seated, madam." Commissary of Police. Catherine and I am cause, that he blew out his chest importantly, sufficiently impressed. And Catherine tried to look. "You wish to see my passport?" she inquired. "Here it is." The commissary eyed her keenly and gave a little grunt. "Thank you, madam," he said, taking the passport from her. He cleared his throat. "But what I really desire is a little information." "Information?" The commissary nodded his head slowly. "About a lady who has been a fellow passenger of yours. Lunched with her yesterday. I am afraid I can't tell you anything about her. We fell you into conversation over our meal, but she is a complete stranger to me. I have never seen her before." "And yet," said the commissary sharply, "you returned to her compartment with her after lunch and sat talking for some time." "Yes," said Catherine, "that is true." The commissary seemed to expect her to say something more. He looked at her encouragingly. "Yes, madam." "Well, monsieur," said Catherine. "You can, perhaps, give me conversation, some kind of idea of that." "I could," said Catherine, "but at the moment I see no reason to do." In somewhat British fashion she felt annoyed. This foreign official seemed to her impertinent. "No reason?" cried the commissary. "Assure you that there is a reason." Then perhaps you will give it to me. Oh yes, madam, I can. The commissary rubbed his chin thoughtfully for a minute or two without speaking. Madam, he said at last, the reason is very simple. The lady in question was found dead in her compartment this morning. Dead, gasped Catherine. What was it, heart failure? No, said the commissary in a reflective voice. No, murdered. Murdered, cried Catherine. She was, so you see, madam, why we are anxious for any information we can possibly get. But surely her maid the maid has disappeared. Oh. Catherine paused to assemble her thoughts. Since the conductor had seen you talking with her in her compartment, he quite naturally reported the fact to the police, and that is why, madam, we have detained you, gaining some information, in the hope of— I am very sorry, said Catherine, don't even know her name. Her name is Kettering. That we know from her passport and from the labels on her luggage. If we there was a knock on the compartment door. Cos frowned. He opened it about 6 inches. What is the matter? He said, disturbed peremptorily. Cannot be. The egg-shaped head of Catherine's dinner acquaintance showed itself in the aperture. On his face was a beaming smile. My name, he said, is Hercule Poirot. Not, the commissary stammered, not the Hercule Poirot. The same, said Mr. Poirot. I'll remember meeting you once, cos, at the Charette in Paris, though doubtless you have forgotten me. Not at all, monsieur, not at all, declared the heartily. But enter, I pray of you. You know of this commissary? Yes, I know, said Hercule Poirot. I came to see if I might be of any assistance. We should be flattered, replied the commissary promptly. Let me present you, Mr. Poirot, to he consulted the passport he still held in his hand, to Madame, Mademoiselle Gray. Poirot smiled across at Catherine. It is strange, is it not, he murmured, that my words should have come true so quickly. Mademoiselle, alas, can tell us very little, said the commissary. I have been explaining, said Catherine, that this poor lady was a complete stranger to me. Poirot nodded. But she talked to you, did she not? He said gently. You formed an impression, is it not so? Yes, said Catherine thoughtfully. Impression was I'll suppose I did. And that, yes, Mademoiselle the commissary jerked himself forward, let us by all means have your impressions. Catherine sat turning the whole thing over in her mind. She felt in a way as if she were betraying a confidence, but with that ugly word murder ringing in her ears she dared not keep anything back. Too much might hang upon it. So, as nearly as she could, she repeated word for word the conversation she had had with the dead woman. That is interesting, said the commissary, glancing at the other. Poirot, that is interesting. Whether it has anything to do with the crime he left the sentence unfinished. I'll suppose it could not be suicide, doubtfully. Said Catherine. Rather no, said the commissary, it could not be suicide. Strangled with a length of black cord. She was Catherine shivered. Cos spread out his hands apologetically. It is not nice, no. I think that our train robbers are more brutal than they are in your country. It is horrible. Yes, he was soothing and apologetic, but you have great courage, mademoiselle. At once, as soon as I saw you, I said to myself, mademoiselle has great courage. That is why I am going to ask you to do something more, something distressing, but I assure you very necessary. Catherine looked at him apprehensively. He spread out his hands apologetically. I am going to ask you, mademoiselle, accompany me to the next compartment. Must asked Catherine in a low voice. To be so good as to, someone must identify her, said the commissary, and since the maid has disappeared, he coughed significantly, you appear to be the person who has seen most of her since she joined the train. Very well, said Catherine quietly, if it is necessary she rose. Poirot gave her a little nod of approval. Mademoiselle is sensible, he said. May I accompany you, cos? Enchanted, my dear Poirot. They went out into the corridor, and Cos unlocked the door of the dead woman's compartment. The blinds on the far side had been drawn halfway up to admit light. The dead woman lay on the berth to their left, in so natural a posture that one could have thought her asleep. The bedclothes were drawn up over her, and her head was turned to the wall, so that only the red auburn curls showed. Very gently Cos laid a hand on her shoulder and turned the body back so that the face came into view. Catherine flinched a little and dug her nails into her palms. A heavy blow had disfigured the features almost beyond recognition. Poirot gave a sharp exclamation. "When was that done, I wonder?" he demanded. "Before death or after?" "The doctor says after," said Cos. "Strange," said Poirot, drawing his brows together. He turned to Catherine. "Be brave, mademoiselle, look at her well. Are you sure that this is the woman you talked to in the train yesterday?" Catherine had good nerves. She steeled herself to look long and earnestly at the recumbent figure. Then she leaned forward and took up the dead woman's hand. "I am quite sure," she replied at length. "The face is too disfigured to recognize, but the build and carriage and hair are exact, and besides I noticed this dash," she pointed to a tiny mole on the dead woman's wrist, "while I was talking to her." "Bone," approved Poirot. "You are an excellent witness, mademoiselle. There is then no question as to the identity, but it is strange, all the same." He frowned down on the dead woman in perplexity. Cos shrugged his shoulders. "The murderer was carried away," suggested. "By rage, doubtless. If she had been struck down, it would have been comprehensible," mused Poirot, "but the man who strangled her slipped up behind and caught her unawares. A little choke, a little gurgle, that is all that would be heard, and then afterwards, that smashing blow on her face. Now why? Did he hope that if the face were unrecognizable she might not be identified? Or did he hate her so much that he could not resist striking that blow even after she was dead?" Catherine shuddered, and he turned at once to her kindly. "You must not let me distress you, this is all very terrible. To me, moment, I pray of you both." "Mademoiselle," he said. "To alas. It is an old story." They stood against the door watching him as he went quickly round the compartment. He noted the dead woman's clothes neatly folded on the end of the berth, the big fur coat that hung from a hook, and the little red lacquer hat tossed up on the rack. Then he passed through into the adjoining compartment, that in which Catherine had seen the maid sitting. Here the berth had not been made up. 3 or 4 rugs were piled loosely on the seat, there was a hat box and a couple of suitcases. He turned suddenly to Catherine. "You were in here yesterday, changed, anything missing?" he said. "Do you see anything?" Catherine looked carefully round both compartments. "Yes," she said, "there is something missing, a scarlet morocco case. It had the initials RVK on it. It might have been a small dressing case or a big jewel case. When I saw it, the maid was holding it." "Ah," said Poirot. "But, surely," said Catherine. "Of course, I don't know anything about such things, but surely it is plain enough, if the maid and the jewel case are missing." "You mean that it was the maid who was the thief?" "No, mademoiselle, there is a very good reason against that," said the commissary. "What?" "The maid was left behind in Paris." He turned to Poirot. "I should like you to hear the conductor's story yourself," he murmured confidentially. "It is very suggestive." "Mademoiselle would doubtless like to hear it also," said Poirot. "You do not object, Monsieur le Commissaire?" "No," said the commissary, who clearly did object very much. "No, certainly, Poirot, if you say so. You have finished here?" "I think so. One little minute." He had been turning over the rugs, and now he took one to the window and looked at it, picking something off it with his fingers. "What is it?" demanded Cos sharply. 4 auburn hairs. He bent over the dead woman. "Yes, they are from the head of Madame." "And what of it? Do you attach importance to them?" Poirot let the rug drop back on the seat. "What is important? What is not? One cannot say at this stage. But we must note each little fact carefully. They went back again into the first compartment, and in a minute or two the conductor of the carriage arrived to be questioned. "Your name is Pierre Michel," said the commissary. "Yes, Monsieur le Commissaire. L should like you to repeat to this gentleman he indicated Poirot, the story that you told me as to what happened in Paris." "Very good, Monsieur le Commissaire. It was after we had left the Gare de Lyon. I came along to make the beds, thinking that Madame would be at dinner, but she had a dinner basket in her compartment. She said to me that she had been obliged to leave her maid behind in Paris, so that I only need make up one berth. She took her dinner basket into the adjoining compartment, and sat there while I made up the bed. Then she told me that she did not wish to be wakened early in the morning, that she liked to sleep on. I told her I quite understood, and she wished me good night." "You yourself did not go into the adjoining compartment?" "No, monsieur." "Then you did not happen to notice if a scarlet morocco case was amongst the luggage there?" "No, monsieur, I did not." "Would it have been possible for a man to have been concealed in the adjoining compartment?" The conductor reflected. "The door was half open," he said. "If a man had stood behind that door I should not have been able to see him, but he would, of course, have been perfectly visible to Madame when she went in there." "Quite so," said Poirot. "Is there anything more you have to tell?" "I think that is all, monsieur. I can remember nothing else." "And now this morning," prompted Poirot. "As Madame had ordered, I did not disturb her. It was not until just before dawn that I ventured to knock at the door. Getting no reply, I opened it. The lady appeared to be in her bed asleep. I took her by the shoulder to rouse her, and then you saw what had happened," volunteered Poirot. "Bien. I think I know all I want to know. Trace, I hope, Monsieur le Commissaire, it is not that I have been guilty of any negligence," said the man piteously. "Such an affair to happen on the blue train. It is horrible." "Console yourself," said the commissary. "Everything will be done to keep the affair as quiet as possible, if only in the interests of justice. I cannot think you have been guilty of any negligence. And Monsieur le Commissaire will report as much to the company." But certainly," said Amdou now. The conductor withdrew. "Cause impatiently." "That will according to the medical evidence," said the commissary. "The lady was probably dead before the train reached Lyons." "Who then was the murderer?" "From Mademoiselle's story, it seems clear that somewhere on her journey she was to meet this man of whom she spoke. Her action in getting rid of the maid seems significant. Did the man join the train at Paris, and did she conceal him in the adjoining compartment? If so, they may have quarreled, and he may have killed her in a fit of rage. That is one possibility. The other, and the more likely to my mind, is that her assailant was a train robber traveling on the train, that he stole along the corridor unseen by the conductor, killed her, and went off with the red morocco case which doubtless contained jewels of some value. In all probability he left the train at Lyons, and we have already telegraphed to the station there for full particulars of anyone seen leaving the train. Or he might have come on to Nice," suggested Poirot. "He might," agreed the commissary, "but that would be a very bold course." Poirot let a minute or two go by before speaking, and then he said, "In the latter case you think the man was an ordinary train robber?" The commissary shrugged his shoulders. "It depends. We must get hold of the maid. It is possible that she has the red morocco case with her. If so, then the man of whom she spoke to Mademoiselle may be concerned in the case, and the affair is a crime of passion. I myself think the solution of a train robber is the more probable. These bandits have become very bold of late." Poirot looked suddenly across to Catherine. "And you, Mademoiselle," he said, "you heard and saw nothing during the night?" "Nothing," said Catherine. Poirot turned to the commissary. "We need detain Mademoiselle no longer, I think," he suggested. The latter nodded. "She will leave us her address," he said. Catherine gave him the name of Lady Tamplin's villa. Poirot made her a little bow. "You permit that I see you again, Mademoiselle," he said. "Have you so many friends that your time will be all taken up?" "Or on the contrary," said Catherine, Elle shall have plenty of leisure, and I shall be very pleased to see you again." "Excellent," said Poirot, and gave her a little friendly nod. "This shall be a Roman policy a noose. We will investigate this affair together." Chapter 12 At the Villa Marguerite. "Then you were really in the thick of it all," said Lady Tamplin enviously. "My dear, how thrilling." She opened her china blue eyes very wide and gave a little sigh. "A real murder," said Mr. Evans gloatingly. "Of course Chubby had no idea of anything of the kind," went on Lady Tamplin. "He simply could not imagine why the police wanted you." "My dear, what an opportunity. I think, you know, yes, I certainly think something might be made out of this." A calculating look rather marred the ingenuousness of the blue eyes. Catherine felt slightly uncomfortable. They were just finishing lunch, and she looked in turn at the three people sitting round the table. Lady Tamplin, full of practical schemes, Mr. Evans, beaming with naive appreciation, and Lennox with a queer crooked smile on her dark face. "Marvelous luck," murmured Chubby. "I'll wish I could have gone along with you, and seen all the exhibits." His tone was wistful and childlike. Catherine said nothing. The police had laid no injunctions of secrecy upon her, and it was clearly impossible to suppress the bare facts or try to keep them from her hostess. But she did rather wish it had been possible to do so. "Yes," said Lady Tamplin, coming suddenly out of her reverie, "do think something might be done. A little account, you know, cleverly written up. An eyewitness, a feminine touch, how I chatted with the dead woman, little thinking that sort of thing, you know." "Rot," said Lennox. "You have no idea," said Lady Tamplin in a soft, wistful voice, "what newspapers will pay for a little tidbit. Written, of course, by someone of really unimpeachable social position. You would not like to do it yourself, I dare say, Catherine dear, but just give me the bare bones of it, and I will manage the whole thing for you. Mr. de Havilland is a special friend of mine. We have a little understanding together. A most delightful man, not at all reporterish. How does the idea strike you, Catherine?" "Elle would much prefer to do nothing of the kind," said Catherine bluntly. Lady Tamplin was rather disconcerted at this uncompromising refusal. She sighed and turned to the elucidation of further details. "A very striking-looking woman, you said? I wonder now who she could have been. You didn't hear her name?" "It was mentioned," Catherine admitted, "but I can't remember it. You see, I was rather upset." "Elle should think so," said Mr. Evans, shock. It must have been a beastly. It is to be doubted whether, even if Catherine had remembered the name, she would have admitted the fact. Lady Tamplin's remorseless cross-examination was making her restive. Lennox, who was observant in her own way, noticed this, and offered to take Catherine upstairs to see her room. She left her there, remarking kindly before she went, "You mustn't mind Mother, she would make a few pennies profit out of her dying grandmother if she could." Lennox went down again to find her mother and her stepfather discussing the newcomer. "Presentable," said Lady Tamplin, "quite presentable. Her clothes are all right. That grey thing is the same model that Gladys Cooper wore in Palm Trees in Egypt." "Have you noticed her eyes?" "What?" interposed Mr. Evans. "Never mind her eyes, Chubby," said Lady Tamplin tartly, "we are discussing the things that really matter." "Oh, quite," said Mr. Evans, and retired into his shell. "She doesn't seem to me very malleable," said Lady Tamplin, rather hesitating to choose the right word. "She has all the instincts of a lady, as they say in books," said Lennox, with a grin. "Narrow-minded," murmured Lady Tamplin. "Circumstances, I suppose. Inevitable under the I'll expect you will do your best to broaden her," said Lennox, with a grin, "but you will have your work cut out. Just now, you noticed, she stuck down her 4 feet and laid back her ears and refused to budge. Anyway," said Lady Tamplin hopefully, "she doesn't look to me at all mean. Some people, when they come into money, seem to attach undue importance to it." "Oh, you'll easily touch her for what you want," said Lennox, "and, after all, that is all that matters, isn't it? That is what she is here for." She is my own cousin, said Lady Tamplin, with dignity. Cousin, said Mr. Evans, her Catherine, don't waking up again. Suppose I call. It is of no importance at all what you call her, Chubby, said Lady Tamplin. Good, said Mr. Evans, then I will. Tennis, he added hopefully. Do you suppose she plays? Of course not, said Lady Tamplin. She has been a companion, I tell you. Companions don't play tennis, or golf. They might possibly play golf croquet, but I have always understood that they wind wool and wash dogs most of the day. Oh God, said Mr. Evans, do they really? Lennox drifted upstairs again to Catherine's room. You, she asked rather perfunctorily. Can I help? On Catherine's disclaimer, Lennox sat on the edge of the bed and stared thoughtfully at her guest. Why did you come? She said at last. Your sort. Oh, I am anxious to get into society. To us, I mean. We're not, don't be an ass, said Lennox promptly, detecting the flicker of a smile. You know what I mean well enough. You are not a bit what I thought you would be. I say, you have got some decent clothes. She sighed. Clothes are no good to me. I was born awkward. It's a pity, because I love them. I love them, said Catherine, but it has not been much use my loving them up to now. Do you think this is nice? She and Lennox discussed several models with artistic fervor. Like you, said Lennox suddenly. Came up to warn you not to be taken in by mother, but I think now that there is no need to do that. You are frightfully sincere and upright in all those queer things, but you are not a fool. Oh hell! What is it now? Lady Tamplin's voice was calling plaintively from the hall. Lennox, Derek has just rung up. He wants to come to dinner tonight. Will it be all right? I mean, we haven't got anything awkward, like quails, have we? Lennox reassured her and came back into Catherine's room. Face looked brighter and less sullen. I'm glad old Derek is coming, she said, you'll like him. Who is Derek? He is Lord Leconberry's son, married a rich American woman. Women are simply potty about him. Why? Oh, the usual reason. Very good looking and a regular bad lot. Everyone goes off their head about him. Do you? Sometimes I do, said Lennox, and sometimes I think I would like to marry a nice curate and live in the country and grow things in frames. She paused a minute, and then added, an Irish curate would be best, and then I should hunt. After a minute or two she reverted to her former theme. There is something queer about Derek. All that family are a bit potty. Mad gamblers, you know. In the old days they used to gamble away their wives and their estates, and did most reckless things just for the love of it. Derek would have made a perfect highwayman, debonair and gay, just the right manner. She moved to the door. Well, come down when you like it. Left alone, Catherine gave herself up to thought. Just at present she felt thoroughly ill at ease and jarred by her surroundings. The shock of the discovery in the train and the reception of the news by her new friends jarred upon her susceptibilities. She thought long and earnestly about the murdered woman. She had been sorry for Ruth, but she could not honestly say that she had liked her. She had divined only too well the ruthless egoism that was the keynote of her personality, and it repelled her that she had been amused and a trifle hurt by the other's cool dismissal of her when she had served her turn. That she had come to some decision, Catherine was quite certain, but she wondered now what that decision had been. Whatever it was, death had stepped in and made all decisions meaningless. Strange that it should have been so, and that a brutal crime should have been the ending of that fateful journey. But suddenly Catherine remembered a small fact that she ought, perhaps, to have told the police, a fact that had for the moment escaped her memory. Was it of any real importance? She had certainly thought that she had seen a man going into that particular compartment. But she realized that she might easily have been mistaken. It might have been the compartment next door, and certainly the man in question could be no train robber. She recalled him very clearly as she had seen him on those two previous occasions, once at the Savoy and once at Cook's office. No, doubtless she had been mistaken. He had not gone into the dead woman's compartment, and it was perhaps as well that she had said nothing to the police. She might have done incalculable harm by doing so. She went down to join the others on the terrace outside. Through the branches of mimosa, she looked out over the blue of the Mediterranean, and, whilst listening with half an ear to Lady Tamplin's chatter, she was glad that she had come. This was better than St. Mary Mead. That evening she put on the mauvey pink dress that went by the name of Super d'Automne, and after smiling at her reflection in the mirror, went downstairs with, for the first time in her life, a faint feeling of shyness. Most of Lady Tamplin's guests had arrived, and since noise was the essential of Lady Tamplin's parties, the din was already critic. Chubby rushed up to Catherine, passed a cocktail upon her, and took her under his wing. "Oh, here you are, Derek," cried Open to admit the last comer. "Something to eat? I am starving." Lady Tamplin, as the door now at last we can have Catherine looked across the room. She was startled. So this was Derek, and she realized that she was not surprised. She had always known that she would someday meet the man whom she had seen 3 times by such a curious chain of coincidences. She thought, too, that he recognized her. He paused abruptly in what he was saying to Lady Tamplin, and went on again as though with an effort. They all went in to dinner, and Catherine found that he was placed beside her. He turned to her at once with a vivid smile. "Elle knew I was going to meet you soon," he remarked, "but I never dreamed that it would be here. It had to be, you know. Once at the Savoy and once at Cook's, never twice without 3 times. Don't say you can't remember me or never noticed me. I insist upon your pretending that you noticed me, anyway." "Oh, I did," said Catherine, "but this is not the 3rd time. It is the 4th. I saw you on the blue train." "On the blue train?" Something undefinable came over his manner. She could not have said just what it was. It was as though he had received a check, a setback. Then he said carelessly, "What was the rumpus this morning? Somebody had died, hadn't they?" "Yes," said Catherine slowly, "somebody had died." "You shouldn't die on a train," remarked Derek flippantly. "I'll believe it causes all sorts of legal and international complications, and it gives the train an excuse for being even later than usual." Mr. Kettering. A stout American lady, who was sitting opposite, leaned forward and spoke to him with the deliberate intonation of her race. "Mr. Kettering, I do believe you have forgotten me, and I thought you such a perfectly lovely man." Derek leaned forward, answering her, and Catherine sat almost dazed. Kettering. That was the name, of course. She remembered it now, but what a strange, ironical situation. Here was this man whom she had seen go into his wife's apartment last night, who had left her safe and well, and now he was sitting there, quite unconscious of the fate that had befallen her. Of that there was no doubt. He did not know. A servant was leaning over Derek, murmuring in his ear. Handing him a note and with a word of excuse to Lady Tamplin, he broke it open, and an expression of utter astonishment came over his face as he read. Then he looked at his hostess. "This is most extraordinary. I say, Rosalie, I am afraid I will have to leave you. The prefect of police wants to see me at once. I can't think what about." "Your sins have found you out," remarked Lennox. "They must have," said Derek, "probably some idiotic nonsense, but I suppose I shall have to push off to the prefecture. How dare the old boy rout me out from dinner? It ought to be something deadly serious to justify that," and he laughed as he pushed back his chair and rose to leave the room. Chapter 13. Van Aldine gets a telegram. On the afternoon of the February 15th, a thick yellow fog had settled down on London. Rufus Van Aldine was in his suite at the Savoy and was making the most of the atmospheric conditions by working double time. Knighton was overjoyed. He had found it difficult of late to get his employer to concentrate on the matters in hand. When he had ventured to urge certain courses, Van Aldine had put him off with a curt word. But now Van Aldine seemed to be throwing himself into work with redoubled energy, and the secretary made the most of his opportunities. Always tactful, he plied the spur so unobtrusively that Van Aldine never suspected it. Yet in the middle of this absorption in business matters, one little fact lay at the back of Van Aldine's mind. A chance remark of Knighton's, uttered by the secretary in all unconsciousness, had given rise to it. It now festered unseen, gradually reaching further and further forward into Van Aldine's consciousness, until at last, in spite of himself, he had to yield to its insistence. He listened to what Knighton was saying with his usual air of keen attention, but in reality not one word of it penetrated his mind. He nodded automatically, however, and the secretary turned to some other paper. As he was sorting them out, his employer spoke. "Do you mind telling me that over again, Knighton?" For a moment Knighton was at a loss. "You mean about this, sir?" He held up a closely written company report. "No, no," said Van Aldine, "what you told me about seeing Ruth's maid in Paris last night. I can't make it out. You must have been mistaken." "Elle can't have been mistaken, sir, I actually spoke to her." "Well, tell me the whole thing again." Knighton complied. "I had fixed up the deal with Bart Hermers," he explained, "and had gone back to the Ritz to pick up my traps preparatory to having dinner and catching the 9 o'clock train from the Gare du Nord. At the reception desk I saw a woman whom I was quite sure was Mrs. Kettering's maid. I went up to her and asked if Mrs. Kettering was staying there." "Yes, yes," said Van Aldine. "Of course. Naturally. And she told you that Ruth had gone on to the Riviera and had sent her to the Ritz to await further orders there." "Exactly that, sir." "It is very odd," said Van Aldine. "Very odd, indeed, unless the woman had been impertinent or something of that kind." "In that case," objected Knighton, "surely Mrs. Kettering would have paid her down a sum of money, and told her to go back to England. She would hardly have sent her to the Ritz." "No," muttered the millionaire, "that's true." He was about to say something further, but checked himself. He was fond of Knighton and liked and trusted him, but he could hardly discuss his daughter's private affairs with his secretary. He had already felt hurt by Ruth's lack of frankness, and this chance revelation which had come to him did nothing to allay his MTSGVMGS. Why had Ruth got rid of her maid in Paris? What possible object or motive could she have had in so doing? He reflected for a moment or two on the curious combination of chance. How should it have occurred to Ruth, except as the wildest coincidence, that the first person that the maid should run across in Paris should be her father's secretary? Ah, but that was the way things happened. That was the way things got found out. He winced at the last phrase. It had arisen with complete naturalness to his mind. Was there then something to be found out? He hated to put this question to himself. He had no doubt of the answer. The answer was, he was sure of it, Armand de la Roche. It was bitter to Van Aldine that a daughter of his should be gulled by such a man, yet he was forced to admit that she was in good that other well-bred and intelligent women had company succumbed just as easily to the Count's fascination. Men saw through him, women did not. He sought now for a phrase that would allay any suspicion that his secretary might have felt. "Ruth is always changing her mind about things at a moment's notice," he remarked, and then he added in a would-be careless tone, "the maid didn't give any reason for this change of plan." Knighton was careful to make his voice as natural as possible as he replied, "She said, sir, that Mrs. Kettering had met a friend unexpectedly." "Is that so?" The secretary's practiced ears caught underlying the seemingly casual tone. "Oh, I see. Man or woman?" "Elle think she said a man, sir." The note of strain. Van Aldine nodded. His worst fears were being realized. He rose from his chair, and began pacing up and down the room, a habit of his when agitated. Unable to contain his feelings any longer, he burst forth, "There is one thing no man can do, and that is to get a woman to listen to reason. Somehow or other, they don't seem to have any kind of sense. Talk of woman's instinct, why, it is well known all the world over that a woman is the surest mark for any rascally swindler. Not 1 in 10 of them knows a scoundrel when she meets one. They can be preyed on by any good-looking fellow with a soft side to his tongue. If I had my way." He was interrupted. A page boy entered with a telegram. Van Aldine tore it open, and his face went a sudden chalky white. He caught hold of the back of a chair to steady himself, and waved the page boy from the room. "What's the matter, sir?" Knighton had risen in concern. "Ruth," said Van Aldine hoarsely. "Mrs. Kettering. Killed. An accident to the train." Van Aldine shook his head. "No. From this it seems she has been robbed as well. They don't use the word, Knighton, but my poor girl has been murdered." "Oh, my God, sir." Van Aldine tapped the telegram with his forefinger. "This is from the police at Nice. I must go out there by the first train." Knighton was efficient as ever. He glanced at the clock. 5 o'clock from Victoria, sir." "That's right. You will come with me, Knighton. Tell my man, Archer, and pack your own things. See to everything here. I want to go round to Curzon Street." The telephone rang sharply, and the secretary tilted the receiver. "Yes, who is it?" Then to Van Aldine. "Mr. Goby, sir." "Goby? I can't see him now." "No, wait, we have plenty of time. Tell them to send him up." Van Aldine was a strong man. Already he had recovered that iron come of his. Few people would have noticed anything amiss in his greeting to Mr. Goby. "I am pressed for time, Goby. Got anything important to tell me?" Mr. Goby coughed. "The movements of Mr. Kettering, sir. You wished them reported to you?" "Yes, well. Mr. Kettering, sir, left London for the Riviera yesterday morning." "What?" Something in his voice must have startled Mr. Goby. That worthy gentleman departed from his usual practice of never looking at a person to whom he was talking, and stole a fleeting glance at the millionaire. "What train did he go on?" demanded Van Aldine. "The blue train, sir." Mr. Goby coughed. "Mantelpiece." Agamemnon spoke to the clock on the Mademoiselle Mirel, the same train. Chapter 14. Ada Mason's story. The dancer from the Parthenon went by. "I cannot repeat to you often enough, monsieur, our horror, our consternation, and the deep sympathy we feel for you." Thus M. Courage, the Juge d'Instruction, addressed Van Aldine. M. Cause, the commissary, made sympathetic noises in his throat. Van Aldine brushed away horror, consternation, and sympathy with an abrupt gesture. The scene was the examining magistrates at Nice. Besides M. Courage, the commissary, and Van Aldine, there was a further person in the room. It was that person who now spoke. "M. Van Aldine," he said, "desires action, swift action." "Ah," cried the commissary, "I have not yet presented you. M. Van Aldine, this is M. Hercule Poirot. You have doubtless heard of him. Although he has retired from his profession for some years now, his name is still a household word as one of the greatest living detectives." "Pleased to meet you, M. Poirot," said Van Aldine, falling back mechanically on a formula that he had discarded some years ago. "You have retired from your profession." "That is so, monsieur. Now I enjoy the world." The little man made a grandiloquent gesture. "M. Poirot happened to be traveling on the blue train," explained the commissary, "and he has been so kind as to assist us out of his vast experience." The millionaire looked unexpectedly at Poirot keenly. Then he said, "I am a very rich man, M. Poirot. It is usually said that a rich man labors under the belief that he can buy everything and everyone. That is not true. I am a big man in my way, and one big man can ask a favor from another big man." Poirot nodded a quick appreciation. "That is very well said, M. Van Aldine. I place myself entirely at your service." "Thank you," said Van Aldine. "I can only say, call upon me at any time, and you will not find me ungrateful. And now, gentlemen, to business." "I propose," said M. Courage, "to interrogate the maid, Mason. You have her here, I understand." "Ada, yes," said Van Aldine. "We picked her up in Paris in passing through. She was very upset to hear of her mistress's death, but she tells her story coherently enough." "We will have her in, then," said M. Courage. He rang the bell on his desk, entered the room. And in a few minutes Ada Mason. She was very neatly dressed in black, and the tip of her nose was red. She had exchanged her grey travelling gloves for a pair of black suede ones. She cast a look round the examining magistrate's office in some trepidation, and seemed relieved at the presence of her mistress's father. The examining magistrate prided himself on his geniality of manner, and did his best to put her at her ease. He was helped in this by Poirot, who acted as interpreter, and whose friendly manner was reassuring to the Englishman. "Your name is Ada Mason, is that right?" "Ada Beatrice I was christened, sir," said Mason primly. "Just so. And we can understand, Mason, that this has all been very distressing." "Oh, indeed it has, sir. I have been with many ladies and always given satisfaction, I hope, and I never dreamt of anything of this kind happening in any situation where I was." "No, no," said M. Courage. "Naturally I have read of such things, of course, in the Sunday papers. And then I always have understood that those foreign trains she suddenly checked her flow, remembering that the gentlemen who were speaking to her were of the same nationality as the trains. "Now let us talk this affair over," said M. Courage. "There was, I understand, no question of your staying in Paris when you started from London." "Oh no, sir. We were to go straight through to Nice." "Have you ever been abroad with your mistress before?" "No, sir. I had only been with her 2 months, you see." "Did she seem quite as usual when starting on this journey?" "She was worried like and a bit upset, and she was rather irritable and difficult to please." M. Courage nodded. "Now then, Mason, what was the first you heard of your stopping in Paris?" "It was at the place they call the Gare de Lyon, sir. My mistress was thinking of getting out and walking up and down the platform. She was just going out into the corridor when she gave a sudden exclamation, and came back into her compartment with a gentleman. She shut the door between her carriage and mine, so that I didn't see or hear anything, till she suddenly opened it again and told me that she had changed her plans. She gave me some money and told me to get out and go to the Ritz. They knew her well there, she said, and would give me a room. I was to wait there until I heard from her. She would wire me what she wanted me to do. I had just time to get my things together and jump out of the train before it started off. It was a rush. While Mrs. Kettering was telling you gentlemen this, where was he was standing in the other compartment, sir, looking out of the window." "Can you describe him to us?" "Well, you see, sir, I hardly saw him. He had his back to me most of the time. He was a tall gentleman and dark, that's all I can say. He was dressed very like any other gentleman in a dark blue overcoat and a grey hat." "Was he one of the passengers on the train?" "Don't think so, sir. I took it that he had come to the station to see Mrs. Kettering in passing through." "Of course he might have been one of the passengers, I never thought of that." Mason seemed a little flurried by the suggestion. "Ah." M. Courage passed lightly to another subject. "Your mistress later requested the conductor not to rouse her early in the morning. Was that a likely thing for her to do you think?" "Oh yes, sir. The mistress never ate any breakfast and she didn't sleep well at nights, so that she liked sleeping on in the morning." Again M. Courage passed to another subject. "Amongst the luggage there was a scarlet morocco case, was there not?" he asked. "Your mistress's jewel case?" "Yes, sir." "Did you take that case to the Ritz?" "Me take the mistress's jewel case to the Ritz? Oh no, indeed." Str. Mason's tones were horrified. "You left it behind you in the carriage?" "Yes, sir." "Had your mistress many jewels with her, do you know?" "A fair amount, sir. Made me a bit uneasy sometimes, I can tell you, with those nasty tales you hear of being robbed in foreign countries. They were insured, I know, but all the same it seemed a frightful risk. Why, the rubies alone, the mistress told me, were worth several £100,000. "The rubies? What rubies?" barked Van Aldine suddenly. Mason turned to him. "I'll think it was you who gave them to her, sir, not very long ago." "My God!" cried Van Aldine. "You don't imply she had those rubies with her?" "I told her to leave them at the bank." Mason gave once more the discreet cough which was apparently part of her stock in trade as a lady's maid. This time it expressed a good deal. It expressed far more clearly than words could have done, that Mason's mistress had been a lady who took her own way. Ruth must have been mad, muttered Van Aldine. What on earth could have possessed her? M. Courage in turn gave vent to a cough, again a cough of significance. It riveted Van Aldine's attention on him. For the moment, said M. Courage, addressing Mason, I'll think that is all. If you will go into the next room, mademoiselle, they will read over to you the questions and answers, and you will accordingly. Mason went out escorted by the immediately to the magistrate, clerk, and Van Aldine sign said. M. Courage opened a drawer in his desk, took out a letter, handed it across to Van Aldine. This was found in Madame's handbag. Chore Amy, the letter ran, and Elle will obey you, I will be prudent, discreet, all those things that a lover most hates. Paris would perhaps have been unwise, but the Isles d'Or are far away from the world, and you may be assured that nothing will leak out. It is like you and your divine sympathy to be so interested in the work on famous jewels that I am writing. It will, indeed, be an extraordinary privilege to actually see and handle these historic rubies. I am devoting a special passage to Heart of Fire. My wonderful one. Soon I will make up to you for all those sad years of separation and emptiness. Your ever adoring, Armand. Chapter 15 The Comte de la Roche Van Aldine read the letter through in silence. His face turned a dull angry crimson. The men watching him saw the veins start out on his forehead, and his big hands clench themselves unconsciously. He handed back the letter without a word. M. Courage was looking with close attention at his desk, M. Cause's eyes were fixed upon the ceiling, and M. Hercule Poirot was tenderly brushing a speck of dust from his coat sleeve. With the greatest tact they none of them looked at Van Aldine. It was M. Courage, mindful of his status and his duties, who tackled the unpleasant subject. Perhaps, monsieur, he murmured, you are aware by whom, this letter was written. Yes, I know, said Van Aldine heavily. Ah, said the magistrate inquiringly. A scoundrel who calls himself the Comte de la Roche. There was a pause, then M. Poirot leaned forward, straightened a ruler on the judge's desk, and addressed the millionaire directly. M. Van Aldine, we are all sensible, deeply sensible, of the pain it must give you to speak of these matters, but believe me, monsieur, it is not the time for concealments. If justice is to be done, we must know everything. If you will reflect a little minute you will realize the truth of that clearly for yourself. Van Aldine was silent for a moment or two, then almost reluctantly he nodded his head in agreement. You are quite right, M. Poirot, he said. Painful as it is, I have no right to keep anything back. The commissary gave a sigh of relief, and the examining magistrate leaned back in his chair and adjusted a pince-nez on his long thin nose. Perhaps you will tell us in your own words, M. Van Aldine, he said, all that you know of this gentleman. It began 11 or 12 years ago, in Paris. My daughter was a young girl then, and of foolish, romantic notions, like all young girls are. Unknown to me, she made the acquaintance of this Comte de la Roche. You have heard of him, perhaps. The commissary and Poirot nodded in assent. He calls himself the Comte de la Roche, but I doubt if he has any right to the title, continued Van Aldine. You would not have found his name in the Almanach de Gotha, agreed the commissary. Elle discovered as much, said Van Aldine. The man was a good-looking, plausible scoundrel, with a fatal fascination for women. Ruth was infatuated with him, but I soon put a stop to the whole affair. The man was no better than a common swindler. You are quite right, said the commissary. The Comte de la Roche is well known to us. If it were possible, we should have laid him by the heels before now, but to foil, it is not easy. The fellow is cunning, his affairs are always conducted with ladies of high social position. If he obtains money from them under false pretenses or as the fruit of blackmail, eh bien. Naturally they will not prosecute. To look foolish in the eyes of the world, oh no, that would never do, and he has an extraordinary power over women. That is so, said the millionaire heavily. Well, as I told you, I broke the affair up pretty sharply. I told Ruth exactly what he was, and she had, perforce, to believe me. About a year afterwards, she met her present husband and married him. As far as I knew, that was the end of the matter, but only a week ago, I discovered, to my amazement, that my daughter had resumed her acquaintance with the Comte de la Roche. She had been meeting him frequently in London and Paris. I remonstrated with her on her imprudence, for I may tell you, gentlemen, that, on my insistence, she was preparing to bring a suit for divorce against her husband. That is interesting, Ceiling, murmured Poirot softly. His eyes on the Van Aldine looked at him sharply, and then went on. Elle pointed out to her the folly of continuing to see the Comte under the circumstances. I thought she agreed with me. The examining magistrate coughed delicately. But according to this letter he began and then stopped. Van Aldine's jaw set itself squarely. No. It's no good mincing matters. However unpleasant, we have got to face facts. It seems clear that Ruth had arranged to go to Paris and meet de la Roche there. After my warnings to her, however, she must have written to the Count suggesting a change of rendezvous. The Isles d'Or, said the commissary thoughtfully, are situated just opposite Hyères, a remote and idyllic spot. Van Aldine nodded. My God! How could Ruth be such a fool, he exclaimed bitterly. All this talk about writing a book on jewels. Why, he must have been after the rubies from the first. There are some very famous rubies, said Poirot, originally part of the crown jewels of Russia. They are unique in character, and their value is almost fabulous. There has been a rumor that they have lately passed into the possession of an American. Are we right in concluding, monsieur, that you were the purchaser? Yes, said Van Aldine. They came into my possession in Paris about 10 days ago. Pardon me, monsieur, but you have been negotiating for their purchase for some time. A little over 2 months. Why? These things become known, said Poirot. There is always a pretty formidable crowd on the track of jewels such as these. A spasm distorted the other's face. I'll remember, he said brokenly, a joke I made to Ruth when I gave them to her. I told her not to take them to the Riviera with her, as I could not afford to have her robbed and murdered for the sake of the jewels. My God! The things one says, never dreaming or knowing they will come true. There was a sympathetic silence, detached manner. And then Poirot spoke in a let us arrange our facts with order and precision. According to our present theory, this is how they run. The Comte de la Roche knows of your purchase of these jewels. By an easy stratagem he induces Madame Kettering to bring the stones with her. He, then, is the man Mason saw in the train at Paris. The other three nodded in agreement. Madame is surprised to see him, but she deals with the situation promptly. Mason is got out of the way, a dinner basket is ordered. We know from the conductor that he made up the berth for the first compartment, that he did not go into the second compartment, and that a man could quite well have been concealed from him. So far the Comte would have been hidden to a marvel. No one knows of his presence on the train except Madame. He has been careful that the maid did not see his face. All that she could say is that he was tall and dark. It is almost conveniently vague. They are alone, and the train rushes through the night. There would be no outcry, no struggle, for the man is, so she thinks, her lover. He turned gently to Van Aldine. Death, monsieur, must have been almost instantaneous. We will pass over that quickly. The Comte takes the jewel case which lies ready to his hand. Shortly afterwards the train draws into Lyons. M. Courage nodded his approval. Precisely. The conductor descends. It would be easy for our man to leave the train unseen, it would be easy to catch a train back to Paris or anywhere he pleases. And the crime would be put down as an ordinary train robbery. But for the letter found in Madame's bag, the Comte would not have been mentioned. It was an oversight on his part not to search that bag, declared the commissary. Without doubt he thought she had destroyed that letter. It was, pardon me, monsieur, it was an indiscretion of the first water to keep it. And yet, murmured Poirot, might have foreseen. It was an indiscretion the Comte, you mean. Elle mean we are all agreed on one point, and that is that the Comte de la Roche knows one subject fond, women. How was it that, knowing women as he does, he did not foresee that Madame would have kept that letter? Yes, yes, said the examining magistrate doubtfully, there is something in what you say. But at such times, you understand, a man is not master of himself. He does not reason calmly. Mon Dieu, he added, with feeling, if our criminals kept their heads and acted with intelligence, how should we capture them? Poirot smiled to himself. It seems to me a clear case, said the other, but a difficult one to prove. He is a slippery customer, and unless the maid can identify him, which is most unlikely, said Poirot. True, true. The examining magistrate rubbed his chin. Going to be difficult. If he did indeed commit the crime, interrupted. If, you say if. Yes, Monsieur le Juge, I say if, began Poirot. It is cause the other looked at him sharply. You are right, he said at last, we go too fast. It is possible that the Comte may have an alibi. Then we should look foolish. Ah, par exemple, replied Poirot, that is of no importance whatever. Naturally, if he committed the crime he will have an alibi. A man with the Comte's experience does not neglect to take precautions. No, I said if for a very different reason. And what was that? Poirot wagged an emphatic forefinger. The psychology. Said the commissary. The psychology is at fault. The Comte is a scoundrel, yes. The Comte is a swindler, yes. The Comte preys upon women, yes. He proposes to steal Madame's jewels, again yes. Is he the kind of man to commit murder? I say no. A man of the type of the Comte is always a coward, he takes no risks. He plays the safe, the mean, what the English call the low-down game, but murder, 100 times no. He shook his head in a dissatisfied manner. The examining magistrate, however, did not seem disposed to agree with him. The day always comes when such gentry lose their heads and go too far, he observed sagely. Doubtless that is the case here. Without wishing to disagree with you, Poirot, it was only an opinion, Poirot hastened to explain. The case is, of course, in your hands, and you will do what seems fit to you. I am satisfied in my own mind that the Comte de la Roche is the man we need to get hold of, said Courage. You agree with me, Monsieur le Commissaire? Perfectly. And you, Van Aldine? Yes, said the millionaire. Villain, no doubt about it, the man is a thorough paste. It will be difficult to lay hands on him, I am afraid, said the magistrate, but we shall do our best. Telegraphed instructions shall go out at once. Permit me to assist you, difficulty, said Poirot. There need be no. The others stared at him. The little man smiled beamingly back at them.